So there are many variations of the concept: development communication, communication for development, or communication for social change. I prefer communication for development. To define this concept, we have to go back to the founding fathers, or the founding mothers of the field. So, for example, in the Philippines, Nora Kebro and the group of scholars at the University of the Philippines, especially in the College of Agriculture, would conceptualize development communication as the art and science of human communication applied to the speedy transformation of society. So the idea was communication and media are the tools for facilitating the process of development. The assumption being that the development they were discussing was the modernistic, the Western concept of development, whereby people move along a linear path to development. This was very similar to what Daniel Lerner in the book, The Passing of Traditional Society, conceptualized, where he argued in 1958 that what the West is, the East seeks to become. So development was conceptualized, even now, was conceptualized as the ability to become like the West. There have been so many definitions, I can't go through them all, but suffice to mention that my own definition of communication for development looks at the use of media and communication to transform the political economy of development. Now, the reason I talk about transforming political economy of development is because no matter how much communication and media you can make available to a people, if the fundamental structure of development is not altered, is not interfered with in order to benefit people, you're not doing anything at all. So if you were to ask me today, as you have done, what is communication for development, or what is development communication? I will say communication for development is the process of negotiating realistic, relevant, and meaningful development, not only to the people on the ground, but also even to the policymakers and institutions that are providing resources and any kind of support. That's how I conceptualize it. It's the process of negotiation. So when we're talking about communication studies, I don't want to separate media from communication. So I believe we are talking about both media and communication studies. I think communication for development is a critical perspective that offers us an opportunity to have a different understanding of the world. So at the moment, the dominant thinking in media and communication is largely characterized by political economy. So I'm talking about institutional political economy, Marxist political economy, and of course, critical theory as well. But I'm talking about Western critical theory here, Adorno and Horkheimer, so there is a preponderance of Western critical theory in media and communication studies. But there is also post-colonial perspectives. I mean, so many other perspectives that enrich our understanding of media and communication. Communication for development brings in a different perspective. It allows us to look at the world from the perspective of marginalized communities. How do they look at their world? So there is this concept in the Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant. It's a German word, I can't pronounce it properly, but let me try. It's Weltanschauung. Weltanschauung. So it's like we're talking about a different perspective of looking at the world. That's what communication for development does, especially when you incorporate it in communication studies. So let me go back a little bit to 2007 and 8, when we had the financial crash, or the banking crisis, which started as a banking crisis. In the aftermath of that crash, a group of students at the University of Manchester established what came to be known as the Post-Crash Economics Society. Now, the reason for this was to lobby for the transformation of the curricula, especially when it comes to teaching economics and the social sciences in the Western University. So these are kids who were concerned about the dominance of Western thinking in Western curricula, Western economics curricula. Now, one of their major arguments was that by focusing on Western thinking, Western theories and Western examples and perspectives, students studying within Western universities were being denied the opportunity to understand the world better, whether it's in economics or social science. Now, the reason communication for social change is critical, especially in Western societies, I think, in my opinion, number one, is that it offers an opportunity for students at universities to have a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the world. So they can study Julius Caesar, they can study Immanuel Kant, they can study Karl Marx, because people forget Karl Marx is a Westerner. They can study Karl Marx, they can study Jürgen Habermas, but they will study that with the understanding that this is just a point of departure for them, so that they're able to explore other knowledges and other theories that can enrich their understanding. They will understand this is not the knowledge or the only knowledge, but one part of the knowledge, and they should be encouraged to go forward to investigate further. The second issue that I think reminds us that communication for social change is relevant in the Western society is that there is a growing political consciousness within Western development industries of the need to involve people on the ground, of the need to develop more ethical, more sustainable forms of development that are relevant to the people we are trying to, whose lives we are trying to improve. And I think this kind of, this growing consciousness, political consciousness, is really relevant because we're talking about training policymakers, training decision makers who are going to make critical decisions about what is to be done in especially much of the world, and of course, within the Western societies themselves. And the other importance of communication for social change in Western societies is that when development communication started in the 1960s, in the Philippines and of course in Latin America, the idea was that development takes place in the global South only. Now, that time the understanding was the global South was in those countries formerly known as the Third World. But working and living in the Western world has reminded me and opened up my eyes to the growing South. There is this global South within the Western societies. So if you're in London, for example, Southeast London is just like Africa. So even within Western societies themselves, they have their own problems of development and underdevelopment. So there is need to understand these parts of societies even before we go out to understand other parts of the world. And the last point I want to discuss there is that is a very personal example, in that the notion of West is a shifting notion. So in the old days, or in those days, we could have said a person who is white is Western, and the person who is black maybe comes from the global South. But it doesn't work like that. A person like me now, I am very much Western. It's hard to say, Linje, you're an African, because I haven't spent, much of my life in Africa at the moment. I'm spending much of my life in the West or in the global North. So there is a changing understanding of this notion, not just of the global North or global South, but even of the notion of West itself. So even when we're talking about Western society, what is Western society? Because you find that Johannesburg, for example, parts of Johannesburg are more similar to Berlin than they are to other parts of Africa. So there is a shifting notion of West. So when we're talking about the relevance of communication for social change in Western societies, I hope we're not just meaning societies in the West like Germany, America, United Kingdom, but we're also talking about, because of changing economics, we're talking about the emerging West within the global South itself. We have the moral and ethical responsibility to understand the global South wherever it is, and to understand the West wherever it is. So that's what I can say. As I said, there is a growing marginalization, especially within the Western world. You know, if you look at Molenbeek, is it in Belgium? Molenbeek in Belgium, you look at Southeast London, even London itself. In the UK, the same thing, Chicago and other, you know, cities in the US. There is a growing economic and social marginalization in the global north. And what I have learned, I think in my opinion, is that the global north does not necessarily have to learn from the global south in terms of the achievements of C4D. Because what I realized was, even though a lot of international development organizations implementing interventions in the global south have been criticized for implementing unrealistic interventions, back home, you find very comprehensive and sustainable efforts at developing their own communities. So there are already excellent examples in the global north of communication for development. It's only that it's not known as communication for development. The key term that is used nowadays is community engagement. But there are all these wonderful examples of development communication in the global north that have not been explored and written about. And even before I answer the next question, what I want to talk about is, or what I want to propose is that your center can investigate these approaches that have been implemented in the global north, but have not been written about because scholars have been obsessed, have focused on looking at the global south. And the consequence is that the assumption has been made that it's only in the global south where development communication has been taking place. But I can assure you, there are a lot of examples of development communication interventions that have been taking place in the global north. So instead of looking at it as a one-way transfer of information from the global south to the global north, let's look at it as an exchange of ideas and experiences. Things that have been taking place in the global north will learn from things that have been taking place in the global south. I think that's how I look at it. But the other issue I think that I would like to mention is that communication for development can be used to bridge the gap between the East and the West, between civilizations, and between people who I think are increasingly becoming more isolated, even in the face of the availability and opportunities made available by social media. We are becoming more isolated. And this is amazing, that even though we have opportunities to communicate by Twitter, by Instagram, by Facebook, there seems to be a growing misunderstanding of what we are all about. People misunderstand each other, so that we are threatened by something as small as immigration, for example, because we don't know each other. And I think communication for development has the opportunity to leverage that kind of interaction. Yes, so many things. I think one of the reasons, very supportive of the idea of a German institution establishing a research center, is that the very notion of development, especially as we have studied it in universities, in African universities, Latin American universities, has been dominated by Anglo-Saxon thinking, American and British thinking. The theorization and everything we learn in terms of how to make policies has been dominated by Anglo-Saxon thinking. I think there is an opportunity for your center to not necessarily bring in different kind of thinking, but ideas to challenge the way we look at the world. I think it's very, very important. Because at the moment, it's like a unipolar world, whereby there is only one way of thinking about and implementing interventions. This center can mediate, can provide an opportunity for alternative discourses to come out. So I'll give you an example. After the Second World War, a lot of countries in Eastern Europe were implementing development interventions. But when you read development theory today, for example, it's as if there's been nothing from this former Eastern Bloc of countries like Romania, all these countries which implemented a different kind of socialist model of development. So when we study development, it's like Romania and other countries never existed. Use the center to not promote these countries, but rather provide an opportunity for people to debate and understand what these models are all about. Because with different kinds of development or development thinking comes different kinds of communication for development. So a different development communication theory brings, a different development theory brings a different development communication. So if we're talking about socialist development, we're going to talk definitely about a different kind of development communication. So I would like you to use that space as an intellectual space where we can debate any kind of development theory without giving priority to one development theory. That's number one. Number two, there is an increasing radicalization of young groups and young people within the Western world. Without sounding too modernistic, I think communication for development can be used as a vehicle to understand that kind of marginalization. Where is it coming from? Why are we experiencing this? Remember, writing in 1960s, Edward Thompson, the British historian, talked about history from below. This is an opportunity for your center to begin to rethink, to begin to offer different theoretical terrains and trajectories on how to conceptualize history. How do we write about this other world that is existing within our Western sphere, where people are scared because people look different, because people dress differently, because people speak differently? How can we improve our understanding of this part of the world that is existing among ourselves? The other issue that I would like you perhaps to think about deeply is to look at military conflict and community engagement. So how can communication for development improve understanding, improve engagement, especially in post-conflict societies? So let me, this is something that has really bothered me. So look at the invasion in Iraq. Invasion in Iraq, invasion in Afghanistan. It was a military intervention. But after the military intervention, you have growing opposition, military opposition to this kind of colonization, to this kind of invasion, to this kind of, push for democracy. You have in the Afghanistan, you have the Taliban coming back. How do we use media and communication to engage with groups on the ground? Not necessarily to solidify colonization or invasions, but to ensure that there is peace and tranquility. So I'm looking at post-conflict societies. I remember reading an article, I think on an American website, where they said we want to talk to the Taliban. But this should have been the first thing to do before the military intervention. You want to talk to them today, you have wasted a lot of money with interventions that have not worked. People are opposing these things. They are bombing schools, they are killing people because they are not happy with this kind of intervention. Maybe if we do it the other way around, whereby instead of starting with a military intervention, we start with communication for development in order to improve our own understanding and prejudices about other people, but also to mediate other people's understanding of us so that we create this kind of communication. That is something that has been bothering me for a long time. I think communication for development can improve what is going on in Afghanistan, can improve what is going on in Iraq by learning the language, by investigating the culture, putting in, investing in anthropological studies and everything else in order to improve our understanding of the world that seems to be hard to access discursively. The other thing maybe I would like to emphasize is the German government has funded a lot of development interventions in Africa. Some of this research is hard to come by. So for example, from the 1970s, the German government used to fund the radio training center in Burkina Faso. It was called Sierra. So from the 1970s, I think 76, up to 2006 when the center closed. This was a fantastic example of development communication. These are things that your center should investigate. Because I don't know why the German government stopped funding this center. It was a beautiful center, and a lot of wonderful broadcasters that we have had on the African continent were trained at this Burkina Faso center. It provided a facility for building the capacity of journalists and broadcasters. You shouldn't, the government shouldn't have stopped funding it. Anyway, let me stop there. I worked with international development organizations, including, among others, UNICEF. one of the things I have learned living in the West is, this is very embarrassing for me. I always thought that white people don't understand development. That's what I thought, that white people don't understand development. But when I came to London, I started working in London and visiting Sweden. I used to go to Malmö University and of course Aarhus University in Denmark, visiting, American University, is it Central American University in Budapest, visiting all these places. I found interesting, fascinating, excellent examples of community development interventions, which have incorporated development communication. Now, my question was, how do white people who I thought don't understand development, how can they implement these great examples of development, community development and development communication? So what I've noticed, I think in my own opinion, there are so many excellent examples within all these countries, especially with regards to communication for development. But we have been so obsessed with the practices in international development. So we have left so much room that has not been investigated in community development in England, community development in Australia, community development or whatever it is in South Africa as well. Most of these are not very different. It's just the terms that are different. So in England, for example, and Australia, they use the word community engagement. Community engagement is just communication for development. Sometimes you find participatory democracy or deliberative democracy. That's just development communication using another term. The practices are not so much different, but what I've seen is there is a reliance on the use of digital technology, especially in much of the Western world, than as opposed to a place like South Africa or any country in Africa. There is a much emphasis on face-to-face communication in much of much of Africa where I come from. It doesn't mean that there is no face-to-face communication here. I mean, they do community cafes, focus group discussions, but there is a reliance, I think, in my opinion, on the use of digital technology and media technology.